So today we're going to begin by looking at Jean Cocteau's La Belle et la Bete, which is one of my favourite films. I love Cocteau, and I'm particularly a fan of his film Orphée, which is an updating of the Orpheus myth, which he made a few years after this one.
Yeah.
But it'll give us an opportunity to do some filmic analysis and talk a bit more about magic as well, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. I was thinking about what it is that I might say about the piece as a kind of prelude or a kind of introduction. And it's really interesting for me to think about Cocteau himself, a polymath, one of the preeminent figures of 20th century art, a novelist, a critic, a screenwriter, a visual artist, and a film director, very, very well known in Dadaist, surrealist, avant-garde circles. Obviously, this piece is 1946. It was released, but in a weird way, it kind of marks a jubilee of Western cinema. If you think about, if we count from August and Louis Lumiere's first public screening, paid public screenings of this kind of decalogue of shorts, the longest of which I think it's factory workers leaving the Lumiere factory, 46 seconds. 50 seconds if like the 17-meter, 56-foot film is like hand-cranked. That's the distance between 1895 when that took place and 1946 is 51 years. And the difference, it feels like such a magical realization of this technology. And I think you see that on full display in both simple, ostensibly simple, and really effective ways in Cocteau's hands.
It's funny, isn't it? Because one of the ways in which cinema has been thought about in terms of early cinema is this distinction between Bete, which is the Lumiere brothers basically kind of taking a camera and pointing at a subject, and then kind of that itself being something remarkable in the cultural landscape of the time. But also kind of this idea of the magic of cinema, and the other kind of major auteur of that period is Méliès.
Exactly.
And of course, Cocteau is much more on the side of Méliès than he is on the side of the Lumieres.
Yeah.
In thinking about cinema not as a technology of recording,
exactly,
or documentary, but of something with which to do literal magic or visual magic. And there's quite a strong connection, isn't there, in Cocteau between cinematic technology and what we might kind of think of as theatrical stage illusionism.
For sure. Yeah, I think this idea that really, in so many ways, elevates and propels Cocteau's thinking about the medium and the technology. He constantly talks about poésie in so many different, his film journals, for example, and a variety of interviews and critical pieces written about him and from him himself. This idea that poésie is not necessarily technologically specific, nor is it's such an intermedial or supermedial ethos. And I love the fact that that's kind of front and center in the beginning of this film, which begins with this kind of palimpsest, ultimately, this chalkboard where you see the film kind of thought through, written, erased, this kind of ostensible rebuking of this kind of vérité, like idea, really. The first shot is about like the filming of the film. The first shot is not even in the mise en scène quite yet. It's not really in the diegetic world. It's really drawing attention to the reality to then countermand it or overturn it, to put forward poesy over, as you say, sort of a metrical, sort of even utilitarian or kind of objective recording.
One of the other things as well, which I often talk about with my students, is the idea of the title sequence.
Yeah.
And its ontology, really, kind of, is it inside or outside
Exactly.
And much later films, of course, because of television, you'd often have the title superimposed over parts of the action. This is a time-saving kind of a thing, rather than having a standalone title sequence. The most famous ones, of course, of the James Bond franchise, where that in itself it has an aesthetic of its own.
For sure.
But how do you think about titles as a part of the architecture of filmmaking, but also part of the architecture of the cinematic experience?
It's very interesting you asked that, because there's two other pieces on the syllabus that I think kind of deal with this in some way. The first that comes to mind is Svankmeyer's Alice in Wonderland, in which the title or the sort of the preamble, the prelude, is kind of used to instill in the viewer a sense of ambiguity. specifically when it comes to adaptation and interpretation, to say, well, kind of keep an open mind. It's very didactic, the use of that space, this kind of interim liminal space before, but not quite outside of the piece itself. Whereas you think of something like MGM's Pride and Prejudice, where the title sequence is, for a lot of people who might not necessarily have a great deal of facility or experience with the text itself, it's didactic or helpful. It's kind of like a guide or, like an actual cinema program to be like, who are the players? Where are they from? What are their relationships and lines of flight? To kind of in so many ways inform what it is that the viewer will view and feel about as they view it.
Yes.
So I like both in the sense of kind of instilling or drawing attention, the idea that the images that you might see should be left open to interpretation, to kind of have this ambiguity foregrounded, but at the same time to be used quite instructively and didactically to kind of just help a viewer just make sense of what it is that they see, especially if it's a broadcast or spanning quite a large period of time.
Do you think the Cocteau one in La Belle et la Bête is something to do with this idea of poesy and the imagination? That kind of, in a sense, the kind of the title sequence is interstitial.
Yeah,
it's kind of, it's not quite the film, but it's what we're moving into some other space.
For sure, I think he's totally doing that. And what I like about, I talk about it with my students a lot as well, because I think it's really, it's so much more than the sum of its ostensibly simple parts, because unlike Svankmajer, Cocteau is very unambiguous about what it is that he's trying to exhort the viewer to feel. Once upon a time, these kind of 4 words, this idea of a direct, not even injunction, but an invitation and a pleading to kind of suspend your disbelief, to kind of show you the reality. It's kind of like a stage magician showing you the mechanism of the trick, and then you still being wowed by the trick. Like, Nolan shows you each stage of, of the entire magical act in its 3 forms, but it doesn't stop you from feeling the sense of wonderment, the sense of craft, the sense of illusion being brought to bear, even in the explication of the illusion itself. And I love that because he's successful. By the time you get to the last shot and they're just kind of flying off into a weird bank of clouds.
Where are they going?
Yeah, exactly. There's questions, obviously. There's, lines of flight and critique that you take with you, but you're also kind of above it. There's got the suspensory quality to that. And I think he does so directly. And I think it pays dividends to kind of approach it as directly as he does. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I like, there's a couple of things there that I really like. Kind of, one is that suspensory quality. I really like that. And that kind of moves from the beginning to the very ending, isn't it? Where kind of that sense of closure is very much suspended. We don't know.
Precisely.
What happens.
Yeah.
But the other thing I'd like to pick up is what you said about making the audience feel, because I think that this is one of the things that distinguishes Cocteau from other filmmakers of the surrealist filmmakers, like Buñuel, for instance,
exactly,
who's very much a filmmaker of the head. Kind of in Chenin de Lou or John the Bourgeoisie, or whatever it might be. The laughter is not to do with kind of gut feeling; it's to do with the kind of satire.
Exactly,
and so it's working on
the pastiche. And so
yes, exactly. Yeah, and also I think kind of lots of the art of Dada and surrealism are very much in that kind of mode, aren't they?
Yeah,
they kind of. Not intellectual exercises exactly, but they are working with a particular set of quite estranging principles.
Truly, yeah.
With collage and that kind of stuff, which you're forced to interact with in a certain kind of way. Whereas I think Cocteau, even though he's a kind of someone he's slightly to the side of them and he's using sometimes not dissimilar techniques, I think that idea of feel is really, really important to
I concur.
To its pitch.
For sure. And it's a matter of accessibility ultimately, because as you say, I mean, the Dadaists, the surrealists, the situationalists who came up, it is cerebrally inflected, and in so many ways informs the feeling, and might even the feeling might depend on some facility with that kind of cognitive acuity, if you will, some kind of familiarity with these terms and concepts and practice and technique. But praxis in Cocteau's hands is not prohibitive. It's not a bar of entry. It's such an honest, it feels to me anyway, as such an honest, simple, candid invitation, as opposed to an intellectual game, right? To show you the framing of the shot before you move into it. you kind of go together as opposed to, somebody sending you there.
Yes. One of the, I've just been kind of making notes. So you mentioned the idea of cognition, and I mentioned estrangement before. And both Kwasu and I are kind of deeply steeped in science fiction.
It's true.
But Cocteau is a kind of filmmaker who it's more to do with the cine fantastique, isn't it?
Yeah, actually.
So he's not a science fiction filmmaker. He's someone whose idea of the fantastic is not to do with estrangement.
Exactly. Well put. I think that's such an interesting way of thinking about a slightly late, maybe tending toward a fin de siècle post-romanticism, where in which, the nature of kind of what things like the sublime actually represent as sort of internal or external forces, lines of flight, pressures, invitations, feelings, and so on and so forth. Who has access to those? Who has power, control over this ostensibly uncontrollable? I like the fact that Cocteau has this very... the word that I used to describe everything about that film. Some people, malign it as over-opulent, but I see it as very generous. There's a lot to see and a lot to feel about what you see. And I think that's a different way of kind of approaching these, very large concepts and psycho-emotional registers in a way that doesn't necessarily require the cerebral to kind of make sense of.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, that kind of both in this film and in Dorfe, it's really oriented around domestic space.
Precisely.
And so therefore there is this kind of sense that we're not plunged into a realm that we don't really comprehend or is so different from our own. When we do that, when we enter the castle with the father, we've already had a situating kind of setting in which we can understand an emotional patterning. So in a sense, the dilemma that he's forced to kind of confront when he plucks the rose is one that we can understand on a very visceral level.
Precisely, yeah. And I think that, setting aside the very rich conversation we could have about text to screen adaptation insofar as this particular bit of folklore, the means through which its own adaptation is realized is predicated around these familiarities in such a way that kind of, in a way, it's a kind of it's a tactical move on Cocteau's part, I think, because it does allow him to maybe focus his attentions on some of the actual mise en scène itself and some of the tricks and illusions that he wants to bring to bear. Some of which are terribly simple. I forget. I think one of the on-set aides' name was Clément. And the beast, when he's very tight, like a 50 on him, Clément's behind him with the stick, just poking his ears to kind of make them stand up. And Cocteau in his film journals writes about how much he loves the effect, how amazingly enriched and embodied his bestiality, his animality feels just from this simple little device, which in and of itself is such a, much like stage magic, much like illusions, I describe as a complex mechanism for a cheap trick, often. But the effect, captured in the way that it's captured and lit in the way that it's lit, just adds so much depth, and quite simply too.
Yeah. It's interesting because that's almost like puppetry.
Yeah.
So kind of you're kind of manipulating the kind of the costume with a stick. And there is something of that, I think, in Cocteau, isn't there? There is something of the idea of a world that you have to invest in, like a puppet show, which isn't real, but there's something to do with the way in which that world is presented to us, that we are able to invest emotionally in the kind of goings on. So in a sense, I didn't know it was a stick, and that's a kind of I obviously know how some of the other things were done, but that's kind of, and that is a really important moment, isn't it, when the ears go up?
Yeah, because it adds to the believability and the uncanniness of that kind of interstitial ontological position that the beast occupies.
Yes.
Is like, whoa, his ears are flicking like my cat's, and I could imagine being an audience member in 1946, seeing that and thinking to myself, wow, like they really went out of their way to invest in this image, to kind of imbue it with not only a paradoxical, fantastic reality, but it adds such a resonance to the ostensible presentation of the struggle between his humanity and his animality. It just adds to it. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. One of the things I suppose we should kind of talk about in that opening scene is the fact that it's the French language that is really kind of that's on the board.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
And so, obviously this is made in 1946, so it's just directly after the Second World War. a period when the French public had not had access to Hollywood films, and they would be flooded with them very, very shortly.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's interesting how, I suppose, French cinema of that particular period, I'm thinking particularly of Jacques Tati's Jeu de Fête, which is the same year, are very interested in ideas of Frenchness, and particularly of a kind of La France profonde, kind of the deep France.
Sure.
Which and of course certain kind of ideas of Frenchness because of the Vichy kind of government in the south, but also because of occupation up to 1944. I think there's an interesting dialogue to do with that, not necessarily recuperating Frenchness, but offering it up again as something which is to be spoken about and also to be critiqued, perhaps.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, when I think about, as you say, the initial sort of locale where the story and I guess the stakes are no pun intended, driven in, emotional stakes and otherwise, is this real sort of provincial kind of, I think of Provence, like it's got this kind of, on the one hand, the gentillesse of a kind of gentleman farmer, but it's still sort of very much entrenched in these kind of long-standing traditions of primogeniture, inheritance, and so on, which is all, part of the sort of propelling action. But then when you go to the Beast's Castle, despite all its Gothic, Baroque largesse, is kind of in a state of disrepair, in a state of ruin.
Yes.
I mean, there's the shot where you see the Beast and Belle kind of going on a bit of a promenade on the grounds, and you see like the hound statues interspersed kind of evenly. But there's this ruinous quality to it as well. It might be a commentary on the sort of dilapidated state of that kind of that force majeure that the French used to have or perceived to have as part of their national identity and the narrative thereof, trying to be critiqued or maybe resurrected to some degree. Yeah. Fantastically, maybe only through myth or maybe through folklore.
One of the interesting things is that when, even though the father plucks the rose, you can't tell what season it is.
Yeah.
Is it
well
autumn?
Noted.
Is it summer?
Well
is
noted.
It spring? Whereas in Tati's film, it's kind of Jeu de Fête. It's basically it's the end of the summer. They're getting the harvest in, and the kind of in the village, kind of a travelling kind of carnival fair arrives.
Sure.
And the kind of this is the kind of the weekend in which they kind of have their and Tati plays a postman who gets obsessed with the idea of Le Postman again, and he wants to kind of zoom around the village at jet speed, and it ends up very badly for him. He plunges into the river. But in a sense, it's kind of really important because it's reasserting this kind of the ancient rhythm of life. That kind of it's harvest time. Right at the very end, actually, he's been given a lift back after looking very doleful and sad for himself, and he's kind of on a cart, and he's got these kind of post bike on the back. And he stops, and there are all these people in the field, and they kind of shout to him, and he jumps off, and he partakes in getting the harvest in, and so kind of that's the very last bit of the film. And so kind of there's this kind of idea of the reassertion of an older way of life, which underlies modernity, and in fact kind of countermands modernity.
Surely.
In the end. So if it's not nostalgic, and I think kind of Tati, I don't think he is nostalgic, but he's very, very definitely critical of post-war modernity. But I think kind of that idea of the deep France as a kind of out of time, that there's something to do with this idea of establishing a space in which the French can look, perhaps deal with the traumas of the last 5 years, but also in a way leap back over them and leap forward over them as well at the same time. I
see what you mean. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's excellently put. And I do think, because when you do watch the film, and the issues and the debates that are taking place between the characters are very realistic, despite being in this kind of fantastical setting. I mean, this idea of obviously desire, obviously issues and debates in terms of gender relations, sexual violence is there, money, trade, fortune, but it in that sense, it's forward-gazing, insofar as these kind of very ostensibly deeply rooted capitalist issues that, most post-war nations in the West were having to deal with, in which these ideas of national grandeur and these myths and legends that they had to propel them through ardent and severe global conflict fell away, were killed on the battlefield and left there. And as such, trying to sort of recoup something of that of that second wind, if you will, looking backward to try and find it somewhere, but find it in some way that's not real. Find it somewhere in a kind of dream time. Yes. And in a weird way, the film takes place in this paradoxical real dream time. It can feel really timeless, unaffected by time and arrhythmic in that sense. But at the same time, what it is that it's dealing with and that propels the narrative forward is so realistic, or can be read that way. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and perhaps the rose then, because there's that wonderful shot, isn't there, where she kind of seems to kind of. It's when she's in the castle and then she wants to go back and see her father, and she suddenly seems to. It's a theatrical trick. She emerges out of the wall. Yeah. In this kind of flowering, this kind of, and it's like the rose, isn't it? Because she is the rose. And I suppose there's something to do with that idea of not emergence necessarily, but kind of budding. Or there's something in the kind of the organicism, I suppose, of the conception of time and of human social connection with nature, partly instantiated in the garden, which is kind of informs a kind of poetics and politics of renewal, maybe. Truly. And I also love that idea when taken in conjunction with the way in which it's realized, because it's not necessarily an arrêt. It's not the camera's on and then somebody it's stopped, somebody steps out, somebody steps back in, and there's turned back on again to make that the apparition of an object within the field of vision to be very abrupt. It's a fade. The wall kind of melts away. Yes. An edifice, a structure, a support, a barricade, a boundary dissolves. Yes. Quite gently, and something emerges from behind or within it, as opposed to this hard arrêt. I quite like, because he could have done it that way. Yeah. And I like maybe something more of I think there's something far more transitionally obvious in that form of transition shot, a fade, like a melt, a peel even, as opposed to sort of like a hard arrêt. Yes. I'm thinking of, Caligari, Mabuse. I'm thinking of older films, which, they made quite significant use of the arrêt. Yes. And it's just so forceful and abrupt insofar as thinking of change, transition, and emergence. So I like the fact that what you describe is presented through the fade. And thinking of national identity and all these ideas of sort of ideology, culturation, global standing, history, and so on as an edifice that in and of itself fades away, and something else comes out, something newer and younger. Why do you think kind of he is so insistent upon the theatrical within the cinematic space? Because you might kind of say, this kind of would seem to suggest a kind of slightly pre-modern cinematic technique. Sure. It's only, isn't it, in a film like The Wizard of Oz, 1939. It's precisely the same. He uses precisely the same theatrical effects to kind of move people through the floor and all that kind of thing. I'm Melting, most famously, where she disappears through the floor. But for me, in La Belle, it doesn't make it seem antediluvian. It doesn't make it seem a kind of a film which is reliant upon a prior imaging technology. It's more that I don't know. That is it synthesizing? How would you describe it? That's such a great question, because I thought about that as well. Specifically at this time, and slightly before, maybe the decade preceding, and maybe 2 decades preceding that. I think a lot of people see or think that a lot of auteurs at the time or people involved in cinema were using the theater. This happens in Bombay cinema as well, where in which people were thinking that theatrical devices, theatrical staging, scene dressing, etc., and so forth, all the accoutrements that go into whatever cultural version of theater were used as a kind of buttress, as the scaffolding upon which to superimpose film. But its core was theatrical. The way it was captured was cinematic. But I think Cocteau is in a weird no man's land, in a weird interstice, because sometimes it does feel very theatrical, and other times it feels deeply dreamlike. Yes, I'm like this. This feels like you put a lens on an unconscious, and you caught it. maybe that's an emotive quality, but I think the mise en scène and the actual way in which it's captured really lends to that. So I don't think it's either. I don't think it's quite like quote unquote full blown cinematic, because I mean, some of the camera movement and so on and so forth might be rustic by comparison to sort of things that follow, but it's certainly not purely theater. It doesn't feel as if it's reliant on the scaffolding, the foundation of theater and its techniques in order to realize its own images.
No, and I think one of the things that I suppose in the classes that when we taught this kind of film before, I tend to look at the scene where the father goes into the castle in relationship to the scene where Belle.
I love comparing the two.
Enters the castle, and for the father, it's kind of theatrical because you've got the arms.
It's true, yeah. This kind of disembodied arms protrude, like holding candelabras, or the mantelpiece being some sooty face with some steam coming out of his mouth, or a disembodied arm pouring wine into a tankard. And in that sense, it does. So when you think of, I think it's Henri Alcan, who's the cinematographer, this idea that he was really trying to capture something of Gustave Doré and Vermeer. The still lifes, which are only given movement by some weird disembodied arm, it feels quite painterly. I would even gesture to sort of like, high art, Baroque art, and so on as the kind of the...
With the grapes. And
the imagistic précis. The cornucopia, the largesse in this kind of domestic space, as you see in Vermeer and others. But maybe some of the techniques to disembody an embodied presence that has to be partialized in some way is very theatrical, for sure.
Yes, yeah. Yes, no. But when the candles are lit, that's the film reversed. So even within that theatricality, he's using a kind of filmic technique.
Exactly.
So kind of,
That's well noted.
Yeah, so it's really lovely that, I think, kind of that entry into, as you say, it's a doubled space, isn't it? Kind of, it's both theatrical and cinematic.
Exactly.
And I think that's part of the reason how he gets this kind of uncanny dreamlike quality.
Precisely, the admixture of them.
Yes.
But in a tension with one another. That's not ever fully synthesized in something anodyne. Or something in and of itself that doesn't countermand itself as it goes. And I think that gives it this kind of weirdly timeless quality. And not just in terms of its technical acumen, but just in the feel of it. Because there is something deeply nightmarish about that scene.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like a haunted house. It's something carnivalesque. It's kind of, in the Bakhtinian sense, there is a simultaneously an overswelling and a partialization, all these disembodied bits.
Yes, absolutely.
But all that come together in this kind of like very hyper opulent milieu, which is not denuded of danger, but that danger in and of itself feels close but not imminent.
Yes,
it's fantastic. I love that.
Well, it's kind of located in the father, isn't it? Because everything else that goes on is uncanny, but there's no sense of threat there.
Yeah.
So in a sense, kind of our if we do feel a sense of uncanniness, it's partly through his reaction.
Yeah, that really does inform how to take what you see.
Yes,
like absolutely. Through him. Yes. Whereas, so I mean, how would you compare the two? I mean, where the father's entry into the Beast Castle versus Belle's entry into the Beast Castle?
Well, I suppose for her, the actual sense of space is different, isn't it? Because the camera is much deeper.
Yeah.
And we don't follow him in. We see her emerge into the space. It's slow motion.
Yeah.
And we had non-diegetic music over
Truly,
the top.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's repeating that scene, but it's really using a completely different register of technique.
Well said. Which then itself bespeaks a different sort of emotional register.
Absolutely.
Yeah, more wonder. Yeah. I like her because she's just like floating. I mean, through that hallway. That's one of my favorite shots
Which
ever.
is on the trolley.
Yeah.
Yes,
And her just sort of, like just hear, Cocteau on a loud one, just like float.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
With wind machines.
Yeah.
It's interesting because in Orphée, he uses a very, very similar thing when the Orpheus and Ertabis, the kind of his angel kind of guide,
right,
are in the passageway between the real after they go through the mirror, between that and the underworld. And he uses precisely the same technique, but with back projection. So he uses wind.
Cool.
They're kind of moving, but not moving.
Right.
There's this wonderful moment where someone passes in front of them holding, I think, a kind of a chicken cage or something on his back. and then they kind of pass out a shot in the foreground, and then they enter the back projection kind of behind them. It's absolutely fabulous. You kind of think, how did he get from there to there?
Right.
But obviously, it's just a kind of very well presented, kind of cinematic trick. But
well blocked.
Exactly. But I think that again, that kind of corridor scene in Orphe is another one of those interstitial spaces.
Yeah.
It's that portal.
Yeah, that's in a word, exactly. And a space of transition. Like you're not supposed to stay in the corridor. You're either you're moving through it or you're on either side of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So is the castle then itself interstitial?
I would say so.
Yeah.
Because it kind of, even when both the father and Belle find it, it kind of just apparates.
Yes.
And I love the fact that a not small portion of it was actually shot on location, which then I think makes the kind of uncanniness that you do encounter in the interior space all the more surreal.
Yes.
Because you are kind of move out of reality.
Yes.
Quite literally. Yeah. Into some kind of weird... You're on location and you move into the interior, and then in the interior you can kind of do what you want. It's kind of like falling asleep. You can... That's where, the odd admixtures, the uncanniness, the sort of unconscious... I mean, obviously there's eatable stuff riven throughout, but I mean... Setting that aside, just the kind of uncanny dreamlike quality is allowed or facilitated not just in the interior space, but can only be arrived at if you move through the corridor from the outside into the inside, from like awake to asleep. It's that, and I love the fact that that's why I love this. I'm so glad that he chose to make it not only slow motion, but to have like score backing it, because it has this kind of lulling, soporific quality to it. It's Morphean in that way, yes. And I love that's the way in which the transition is presented.
I mean, lots of surrealist kind of artists and filmmakers are clearly influenced by Freud.
Yeah,
and you mentioned the Oedipus complex just then. Do you feel that Cocteau is imagination of dream here is a Freudian one, or is it something else?
Ooh, that's really interesting. I think there are... I mean, if we think about like the dream work specifically, I think there are there's some Freudian aspects insofar as, like sublimation and the admixture of things, I mean, obviously embodied in the beast himself, that play themselves out. And there's a deep... I've asked my students before whether they think that there's this very deep undercurrent of sexuality running through the piece.
Yeah.
Not just in this kind of Bildungsroman emergent sexuality, but the kind of, the interruptedness in a very Freudian sense of a type of sexuality, certain drives, thanatotic and erotic alike. But I do think the way in which Cocteau kind of goes about it, on the one hand, is quite fearless. And on the other hand, so deeply steeped in deferral. There's so many sort of ways around what it is that he's kind of like gesturing to. And obviously, I mean, the performances in and of themselves put that across. But is it deeply or fundamentally Freudian? I'm not sure. How about yourself? Do you think that it's conscientiously, I could even put it that way, steeped in those ideas? Or just kind of sort of glancingly sun grazing them? Yeah,
I mean, I think I agree with you really that kind of particularly in terms of, I suppose, the presentation of the beast, and masculine sexuality, that seems to suggest a kind of something in which kind of a Freudian sense of repression and its return is quite clear. Well, it's easily decoded. Yeah. But I think the idea of dreaming is slightly different, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because it's in a sense cinematic dreaming, and collective dreaming.
Very nice.
And so I think that means that kind of, unlike kind of Freud, which is also to do with individuation, there's something in Cocteau which speaks of the archetype.
Right.
And of the collective. And therefore the kind of, almost as though what in that opening sequence that we talked about, that he's put her to sleep. It's a kind of hypnotism.
Well
and we share the dream.
Precisely. And the communal aspect thereof is actually, it's literally the first shot you see, because it's people yelling.
Yes.
It's not just one individual or two players. It's the gaffer, it's the best boy, or the cognate equivalent. Yeah, those best boys for sure. But it's all the sort of dreamers who then build this kind of collective unconscious dream that we're invited to participate in. Yeah. That we are that we're yeah, as you say, kind of hypnotized into this mesmeric quality in this sort of Carl Mesmer way, is very much, I think, a part of both of why it's so effectively fallen into in that Freudian way, in the collective way.
Yeah, and I think just jumping ahead to the ending, we're not meant to wake from the dream, and that's why the ending is so irresolute.
Exactly. Yeah. It's suspended.
Yes.
Yeah. It's almost comatose, but in a way that, I guess, in a way that has all the sort of issues and debates and complexities of anything comatose or anything that doesn't end. Which is really interesting when you think about, from like the Lumiere brothers to Cocteau, 46 seconds to an hour 38 about. And then you're left with this sense of like, did it really ever end in the way that you never really stop dreaming in your entire life?
Yes.
You might, it's almost as if wakefulness might be just a sort of like an intermission.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. To the collective, cinema.
Yeah.
Yeah. In an essay I wrote some time ago on Michael Bay, I called it the cinema within. And I
love that.
Yeah, and I think that's
love that.
Yeah, and I think that's it, isn't it? The kind of that's what Cocteau is encouraging us to inhabit.
For sure, and kind of be like, it's okay. And we know that we know of a rose, we know open sesame, we know these childish things, but follow me here.
Yes.
Like it's okay. And as you say, all of the blood-soaked masses, maybe who are in and of themselves at that particular point in time in history, so guarded, jaded, of course, so dispirited to, in this kind of, we've all of us nationally and globally gone through a situation politically, economically, culturally, and ecologically, in which we have to set aside those childish things. To be like, no, like maybe it's precisely what we need.
To dream again.
Yeah. And it might not be comforting, but it's also something that you do all the time. The Kopf kino never stops projecting.
Yes.
It's always running.
Yes.
And so, like, why not? Why end it? I think it's a really interesting end. I mean, did you find it maybe satisfactory or unsatisfactory?
It's unsatisfactory. Okay. Because they just fly up into the sky and you think, what the hell has happened there? And of course, when he stops being the beast, he becomes this kind of incredibly fey, languid, demasculinized, really, kind of figure who's so utterly other. And he seems also to be kind of not particularly continuous with the beast either.
Yeah, there's no contiguity. And I think it shows in Belle's face, because maybe I'm projecting, but she seems kind of deflated. She seems a little disappointed. Yeah, to be like, oh, what?
Yeah, exactly.
I've said this before in blog posts where I describe, this is, within a sort of Disney space, but Disney princesses typically have to pay, I call it the Disney princess happiness tax.
Right.
Where in which something quite ardent has to be given in exchange for some modicum of happiness that might be superimposed ideologically on them, that they think that they're supposed to want. I think the only exception to that is Atlantis, which is my favorite Disney film, but it's everybody's like least favorite for reasons we could talk about in a different episode. But it doesn't escape my notice that there is this sense of just, it's less dreamlike, it's less open, it's less magical than when you are hirsute.
Yeah, and also therefore what is to be wished for in a sense.
Really. Well put.
Because kind of that fulfillment ends up being a disappointment.
Yeah,
and it's better to have the kind of the rather hairy, prior reality where he's both. Yeah. Than where he ends up being Henry Jekyll. And you kind of think, that's not very interesting.
Yeah. It wakes up in that way, and I think it's purposeful that it's presented as a kind of disappointment in some way.
I mean, if that's when you wake up, it's kind of like saying, well, let's go back to sleep again.
Yeah, precisely. Like let's just, and maybe the suggestion is that in this kind of illimitable, ineffable, numinous horizon in which within which we fly, there is a possibility that we could fall asleep again. There is a possibility that something weird and wonderful might happen to either one of us or us both, and we'll be changed in such a way that what waking was will be inaccessible. We can't wake to that wakefulness anymore. Something would have changed.
Yes.
In a way that like this change or reversal of a change cannot ensconce, cannot fully account for. And I like ambiguous endings like that because I do think, as I say, I do think your cop, the cinema in your brain keeps running that reel in some way. Even if it just kind of hits up against a loop. I kind of like the idea of, and it plays itself out, no pun intended, in my music. I'm terrible at intros and outros. It's just like, it just kind of hits you and then it's over. I like the ambiguity of the end, despite the disambiguity of the beginning. That's
really fascinating. Actually, we should probably do a pod on endings.
Yeah, that would be great.
As well as beginnings.
Yeah.
I remember kind of someone saying that kind of I think it might have been Elvis Costello actually. He said that when he kind of gets with a new group of musicians, if they're British musicians, they ask you how to start. If you're with American musicians, they ask you how you're going to end.
Wow, I love that.
And it's fantastic, isn't it? So much for the fade out.
Yeah, right.
They want to know kind of what the structure is.
Yeah.
Where you're going to get to.
Something conclusive.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting. I mean, the musical analogy is a good one because you think of people like Gustav Mahler, who himself is such a preeminent figure when it comes to the way in which film sounds. I mean, through Waxman, through Harman, and so on, and others. But, Mahler's been noted as saying that, music is about everything that you don't see noted down. It's about the space between the notes. It's a very jazz idea. So it's not so much about the introduction or the ending, where one note begins and ends, followed by the next and so on. It's this interstitial space where the music and the sort of emotive resonance thereof, like the true resonance, capital R, takes place. It's in the gap. And so the bookends in Beauty and the Beast, are so resonant, in this kind of interstitial space between the transformation and the invitation, which I love. And I think Cocteau revels in it. And I think that's why it feels the way that it does. I mean, do you think that the critiques that, people in the Village Voice, I'm thinking of critiques, Roger Ebert, who seemed to be more favorable at the time, well, I think in this list of like 10 best films ever made or something like this, saying that it's true cinematic magic. So they have this kind of positive on the one hand. And on the other hand, somebody from the Village Voice said that its opulence is its downfall because it kind of countermands this ostensible moral of, don't just trust a pretty face or, a sort of a covetous desire, an avaristic desire for wealth will be the ruin of you. I mean, where would you fall on that spectrum?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I tend not to approach film as a moralist, and therefore, I mean, thinking about Cocteau's kind of films, which do have these kind of archetypal, like Orphée, kind of a game. There's a kind of something to do with consequence.
Sure, right.
But I think in both of these films, it's kind of countermanded by what we talked about before as the feel, and that's the total aesthetic experience of the film. That we enter into a contract with this film in which, in a way, the good outcome, the bad outcome, the sense of a moral message or warning kind of has to be set aside in favour of the immediacy of the lushness of the kind of the quality of aesthetic experience that it presents to you. So I think it's and that's why kind of I suppose it's kind of a film which I think is about feel rather than about the cerebral, because even though it's based upon that idea of beauty and goodness rewarded, when we actually get there, it's not much of a reward, and it's kind of like, oh, I might as well go through with it then.
Yeah, exactly. I guess. Yeah. But you're right. I think it is drawing, obviously, from a tradition of fables, which in and of themselves typically have a didactic overtone or undertone. But you're right in saying I believe that that's superimposed with or there's this kind of insurrection that Cocteau does, in which that's supplanted for this, the broad range of qualia that you can feel about, and that you can see it, and that opulence and so on and so forth, derelict as it is, as weird as it is in certain aspects, is so emotively resonant. It feels so much, regardless of what you feel about it. And I think I'm the same with regards to an ostensible moralism being something that I think you're invited to suspend.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's why it begins. I maybe not why, but certainly why I appreciate another aspect of the beginning, because it does invite you to suspend these things at that time in that way in this particular piece.
And I think kind of if you're not willing to accept the terms upon which Cocteau offers you the film, then the film is going to have problems.
Yeah, it'll clang in a way.
Yes, it will.
But interestingly enough, I mean, some of the, as we said, I mean, there's a lot of very real, very pressing issues and debates brought to bear that Belle goes through, and all the stuff. I mean, inheritance, primogeniture, sexual assault, gender, race to some degree. You could read it as a metaphor thereof. Ontology. There's so much of quote unquote intellectual and moral substance, quote unquote, and I use that reservedly.
Yes.
But in a weird way, it finds its resonance in that way, if you choose to read it in that fashion, precisely because it's presented in the fantastical.
Yes.
It reminds me of Wilde, this idea that, if you want to tell them the truth, make them laugh, wear a mask or they'll kill you.
Yes.
That you can't just verite like a post-war, like the fable in and of itself is the perfect vehicle to even if you want to approach those particular topics. I think it works.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, kind of thinking about kind of Cocteau in terms of post-war cinema.
Yeah.
In what's going on in Italy, kind of at the same time, of course, is neorealism.
Yeah.
And it's very much that turn to the documentary form as a way of exploring what has happened to
For sure.
But I think you're right, because in what happens to France, of course, in the next couple of years is they go through the process of decolonisation, but in a much, much more problematic way than other kind of Britain, for instance, do, where they fight a war in Indochina, they fight a war in Algeria. Yeah. And Algeria becomes, of course, the La Guerre sans nom. It becomes the unnameable thing. And it seems to me as though what Cocteau is very early doing in 1946 is precisely what you said about a while wearing the mask, that he understands probably that there are some things which have to be talked about, but they can't be talked about in that way.
Directly.
Because they've been occupied, and because of Vichy. And so therefore what you have to do is to turn to another kind of filmic register to enable those really important issues, as you said, kind of to do with inheritance, old France, gender, and so on, that they can only be really spoken about in displaced terms.
Absolutely.
At this point.
I completely agree. It's like anamorphic.
Yeah.
It's kind of oblique. And I think in so many ways it allows quite literally the bête noire that everybody's kind of thinking of to be embodied.
Yes.
Right? But in this very oblique way. It's
yeah, what is the beast?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yes,
it's very literal and figurative, but it's so simply and consummately done.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I might ask you, maybe as we kind of wade into the deep blue sea of the latter part of the episode,
yes,
what are your favorite things and or shots or scenes, and why?
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I think for me the one is that my favourite shot is that end flowering where she comes out of a hole in the wall essentially, and then just suddenly emerges in this extraordinary way.
It's amazing.
It's a great shot. Because it took me ages to kind of figure out how they've done it. Obviously they packed her in, and then out she comes and just emerges into this space. What about you?
I think aside from the not only because I'm so, I guess, musically sensitive, not only is the score so sumptuous behind the sort of entry of Belle into the castle, but I think it's a perfect shot in every aspect of its diegesis and its extra diegesis. Everything about it, everything that's working and enacted in that particular shot, in my view, is perfect. Her performance, the bewilderment, all of it. Somebody might say, it has some kind of I mean, it's gregarious in the way that sort of like an excitable youth might be, that there's something quite childlike about it, or simple or rustic or old or antiquated, anachronistic, take your pick. But there's something very sincere about it.
Yes.
There's something very sincere running throughout the piece, which makes it easy to feel about, I think. And that sincerity coupled with the music to sort of elevate that sincerity and make it front and center. Even like the register, even the mix, I think is just absolutely perfect. There's only one other scene a scene which I think is as perfect, and that's from Le Jeté. It's the museum scene. I'm like, there's no notes. I don't think you need to change it. I wouldn't even touch it. It should just be left as it is. That shot, and the shot where speaking of magic, there's the shot where Belle's looking in the mirror.
Yes.
And this idea of, the transportive, the portalesque, these kind of sort of egresses and ingresses through these specular surfaces. I mean, I love that in any medium, but it's really cool the way it's done.
Yeah.
I also like the shot of her throw on her bed, like crawling off the bed when she's shown into her chamber. It's it's terrifying, but it's also quite. Yeah. You can see why and where Disney might have been like, hey, we could just animate that and make it cute, as opposed to just uncannily real and a little spooky as a result, because it's kind of like chest burster scuttles off. I enjoy that, and obviously the shot of the beast coming to Belle's bedchamber, and he's like smoking with this unrealizable passion. I love that he's just steaming. I also like the scene. I mean the dining scene, because there's a shot in which Belle's talking about the fact that she appreciates that the beast is doing all that he can to make her unafraid of him, or at the very least comfortable. Yeah. But the way that it's framed is she's a disembodied voice. She's off screen. It's almost looking at a beast in an enclosure. Yeah. It's got this kind of the fourth wall in and of itself becomes kind of a glass in a zoo. Yeah. Or a lab. It's fascinating in that sense, but also the power that Belle really has in that particular situation, something that she's unused to. But it's the power to be honest, ultimately. Yes. She's very frank and very candid with the beast. And the lines of power, the gendered lines of power between them are very interesting in that particular scene. There's also something sexual about it, where he's like, it's voyeuristic in the sense that it's kind of like a voyeur watching a voyeur be a voyeur, in the sense of, we have the scopophilic view of the beast asking if you can watch Belle dine. There's an appetitive, embodied quality, a directness as well, which is mirrored, I think, later when, he's lapping water out of her hand. Yes. And, she like strokes his head and says, he's like, oh, you're ashamed, are you embarrassed, and she's like, no, you're a beast. She kind of reminds him in this very honest but empathetic, sympathetic way. I just love those dynamics in those particular scenes.
No, that's a lovely scene, isn't it? Actually, where kind of he's looking at the water, because there's the intimacy is an animal intimacy.
Yeah, precisely.
Which I think is that's absolutely that's an uncanny space.
Yeah, totally. And in the sense that she has all the presentments of a caring pet owner in a way, but then in the 50s, in the close-ups. There's something very subtle in the performance in which there's this constant sort of coming up against the realization of that interstitial ontology that he possesses, to be like, oh yeah, I can pet his head like a pet, but hang on, I mean, this is kind of like a dude,
and a beast.
Yeah, but what I find fascinating is that it's not framed as an immediate repulsion.
No.
Which complicates it, because again, we're being invited to sort of participate in an ostensibly jejune space, a fairy tale and so on. But these moments are very complex in a Freudian sense, in a psychosexual sense. They're never really taken across a particular line, I'd say. But they're in a Bataillean way. They're very, very fascinated with it. They're very close to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I was thinking actually, as you were talking here, and you were talking about mirrors, and it's a film which is built on doubling and echoes. Obviously, kind of he plays. John Murray plays two roles. Yeah. The castle and the home. Kind of the mirrors and all that kind of stuff. It's a film whose architecture is all about repetition.
Well said. I mean, the father's entry into the castle, Belle's entry into the castle, even the arms of the candelabra. They kind of just look like like doubles or sort of just mirror reflections of one another in a kind of funhouse way.
Exactly so. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's the kind of, I think that's part of the reason that we kind of aren't led towards to use the kind of the funhouse, and we're not led towards the exit.
Yeah.
Because we are still within that. Well, in that symbolic psychosexual structure of mirrors and echoes and repression and sublimation. And so perhaps I should slightly readjust my kind of thinking about Freud kind of in this film kind of but I think kind of you're right, and that lack of closure then is another, as well as not waking up, he doesn't offer you a way out of that symbolic regime.
Truly, yeah, it's always there.
Yeah.
But you're not, and this is maybe just testament to, I don't know whether it's serendipitous or whether it's just a pure representation of his craft. That you don't, might be labyrinthine in some senses, quite literally, she's lost, wandering around, they're kind of stalking each other, she surveils him. I love the fact that she kind of spies on him all the time. And she has access to him in a way, in this kind of terrarium zoological way. I love that personally. But labyrinthine as it might be in certain respects, it's not a trap. Right? No. It's not a coma in that sense. It's not comatose in the sense that there is a will or a desire to wake up, but far rather the opposite. It's a desire to remain ensconced in the dream, to stay there. Yeah. And you encounter all these, these latencies as a result.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that seems to me to be an excellent point at which to conclude
Indeed
our
it is.
Conversation. So, we hope that you've really enjoyed Kwasu and I exploring some of the depths of La Belle et la Bête. So thank you, Kwasu.
Well, thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure, and we will certainly catch you in the next iteration.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.